If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this.
Cops, law enforcement officers, park rangers, and similar professionals, what are the scariest paranormal or creepy things you've encountered on the job?
There's a church on Edisto Island that's the oldest church in America. There is a legend of a girl who got buried alive in a crypt. She was unfortunately discovered too late and died. There are still scratch marks to this day all over the crypt walls, and they took the door down because it would be busted open constantly. There are legends of screaming at night in that graveyard. One particular night, I got called by a police buddy of mine because no one wanted to go out there. Anyways, I had a convoy of at least 5 cars behind me and 1 in front, and we were going very fast to this location. We get there, and it's quiet for a few minutes. We all heard the scream. But the kicker was that it wasn't a scream from a dead human ghost entity. It was a giant white owl, and one of the most beautiful owls I've ever seen, with a giant wingspan. The moral of the story here is that sometimes it's the living things that are more scary than ghosts ever will be. You should have seen as the owl flew out of the crypt a bunch of grown officers screaming like little girls and one nearly shitting his pants. I got it all on film, and to this day, the whole story. This story took place in 2008. The park that I worked at had a very big drinking problem with youths trespassing all the time. We had calls almost every night. I worked nights most of my career. One day, a member of the public who was camping called in, saying that there was a large group of youths making noise and drinking. I was dispatched and started walking over in the dark. I tried to sneak up, this was a breach of my standard operating procedure, to try to apprehend as many as I could. I managed to apprehend 4 to 5, don't clearly remember, and all the others ran into the woods. My prediction was that there were as many as 20 people, based on what I saw. I radioed through to dispatch to get a couple of deputies out here to take over. Deputies arrived at this point. I was all alone in the middle of nowhere. I radioed through to try to get guided back to the more civilized part of the woods. At this point, I had already walked quite far, and the radio connection was breaking up. We had bad radios back then. As I approached a part of the woods, I felt similar. I looked behind me and saw someone walking up to me very slowly. I then called out, "Hello." There was no response. At this point, radio contact was back, and I radioed in, saying that I had spotted someone. At this point, the figure is maybe 40 meters away. I then called out, "Stop, and are you okay?" With no response. As the figure came closer, it just disappeared. I couldn't make out what it was. The next day was a normal day, as mentioned to my friend, who had worked here for 10 years. I mentioned what happened, and he made a scared face and said, "It's nothing." He got up and walked away. In 2013, I left to work at the sheriff's office and never mentioned it to anyone except some close friends while drunk. This might not be the scariest story, but I have only had a couple of other ghost stories. I might put them on here later on. But this sends shivers down my spine. I had a call to a residence for a mental evaluation, or a 51 to 50. Anyways, I get there and speak to a 50-something-year-old woman, who states her 20-something-year-old son is under the influence of an unknown drug and keeps repeating that he can't go in his bedroom because there was an old man hanging in his room. She stated she was too scared to go in his room and investigate it for herself because he constantly brings over friends who are drug addicts and is unsure if his claims are true or not, one former police officer said. I then go speak to the son, who is clearly under the influence of a stimulant. He goes on to tell me that he was told by a spirit not to enter the bedroom because her father, dressed in his military Class A uniform, was hanging in his bedroom. I checked the room out, and of course there was no one hanging in the room. As I'm in the middle of explaining to the mother that there was no one in the bedroom, a veteran officer arrives on scene to assist me. He pulls me aside and states that earlier in his career, he responded to this residence, and in that same bedroom, he had to investigate a suicide by hanging an older male subject. He didn't remember all the details, so I looked it up in our report management system in my patrol car, and sure enough, the officer was correct. The subject who died was a World War II veteran and had dressed in his military uniform and hung himself. Prior to my current career, I was a paramedic. Here is one that stands out to me. We responded to a DOA. The gentleman had passed approximately 8 to 12 hours before being discovered. Rigor was beginning to set in. The death appeared natural. My partner, a student, and I sat at the dining room table to knock out some of the paperwork before the justice of the peace arrived. My partner and I both saw someone walk from the pantry in the kitchen to the garage entry, also at one end of the kitchen. The student, whose back was to the kitchen, asked us who else was walking around in the house. My partner and I saw but heard nothing, and the student heard but saw nothing. The cop with us asked who had just walked through. A search of the pantry, garage, and kitchen turned up nothing. Nobody, other than us, was located in the residence. To this day, I'm still curious. This didn't happen directly to me, but it's one that stuck out for me. I had a fire alarm at a local nursing home. Apparently, the county's morgue is located in the basement too. The cops came back out to the parking lot after they were searching the basement for the FD. The one cop was shaken. He said he saw one of the residents sitting in a wheelchair out of the corner of his eye in the dark. He said he thought it was strange because no residents lived down in the basement. He figured he would continue his search and bring the resident back upstairs when he was finished. After searching, he went back to find him, but he wasn't there. I asked if he could check his body camera, but he was sure he didn't face in that direction to capture it. On a night in 2006 or 2007, I guess, I noticed a campfire in the distance, and I went to investigate as setting up camps in this area was not allowed as conservation efforts were in place. I walked over, no one was here, and I wondered why idiots would let a fire go unattended. So I went over there were about 2 tents, from what I remember, and no one was there. I radioed in and asked for a couple of guys to come to clean up. When they arrived, I went to look for any signs that people were around. I looked around for a couple of minutes and didn't find anything. Then we all left after extinguishing the fire and clearing up. We had one guy stay there as we had unattended equipment. Then I went back to the office. I was due a break. After the break, I went out and saw a group of 3 who seemed fairly distressed. I approached them and asked them what they were doing down this neck of the woods, and they said that they were camping and had been told to leave their campsite immediately. I became suspicious as we had no rangers working there. I asked them who they saw, and they said that he was wearing very old-fashioned clothes and that he supposedly had no face. At this point, shivers were sent down my spine. I told them to go and collect their equipment, and they went to get their equipment, then I saw them leaving. I have only mentioned this to my friend, who has worked in the park since 2006. He hasn't had any reports of such things up to this day. This is one of my scariest stories. I still have no clue what happened, but when hearing that in the dark and in the middle of the woods, shivers were sent down my spine. But what do other people know? I have no clue. My dad used to go to a residence on a regular basis. The woman believed aliens and the CIA were hunting her. She had about 10 huge 50-gallon drums filled with water all around her house to block the radio signals. She got pretty upset one time, so instead of bringing her in or anything, he called them and met them outside. I got them to bring in some random equipment and walk around the house, making it beep. I told her it was all clear and no worries. He gave her his number in case any more emergencies happened. Oh, and there was also one cemetery my dad refused to go by at night. He never told a soul why. Not even my mom. If he got a call that required him to go down that road on night shift, he would go another route to it. Apparently he got into some paranormal shit when he was little, and it scared him. I wasn't the first responder on this one, but support. I was in a medevac unit that provided assistance to local SAR teams from time to time. I was in training to be a crew chief on these missions. I was qualified for out and backs or station runs, but SAR is a different beast. So we have a search pattern, looking for 2 teens that went missing in the mountains about 70 miles from our airfield. Really, y'all pine in a thickly wooded area. They decide they are going to take me and some of the folks who have hiking experience and have us work the trail these kids would have been heading to. Ground-based SAR is coming up from the other side, but they have about 5 hours of hiking to get to where the helicopter can drop us off. The trail isn't very evident from above, so they decide it's faster to put me on the jungle penetrator and drop me through the trees to see if it's a good place to drop the people going on foot. I get on it, ride down about 150 feet, and there's a guy leaning against the tree in front of me, just watching me. Makes eye contact with me. Kind of old-fashioned clothing, really old rifles and machetes, neither of which is that unusual in that area. Many of the backcountry folks dress like it's the late 1800s or early 1900s. He looks at me and mouths something like, "Over there, I've got ear protection in and I'm under the freaking helicopter." Points to the ridge next to us. I go up, we go over there, and we find them about 30 minutes later, down the side of the ridge with a friend with a broken leg. 2 weeks later, I run into one of the guys we worked with, who tells me the kids kept insisting they had been chased off the trail by an angry guy with a machete. I was a PO for 4 years, not really investigating but seeing something. I was patrolling the neighborhoods one night on Graves, and at about 3 a.m., this weird fog rolled into town. The city is out in the desert southwest, now the fog is really dense, and I can just see what seems like 10 feet in front of me and decide to go back to the station to wait it out and finish reports. As I'm leaving the subdivision, I turned down a street where there was a major traffic fatality where the woman was ejected from her vehicle after losing control at around 80 miles per hour about 1 year prior. As I reach where the accident happened, I see a woman standing in the median with a yellow silhouette, and I am like, WTF? And immediately try to catch a glimpse of this person with the spotlight. I cannot see anyone there, but I do see this yellow silhouette move across the street through the rear view mirror. Now I rush to turn the patrol car around and try to catch up with her, but soon I see the yellow silhouette disappear, heading towards the desert. I figured there were tractor trailers parked along the side of the road, and the driver was getting ready to leave, but as I reached where I last saw the yellow silhouette, there was nothing there. I sit there in silence for what seemed like 30 minutes with the amber lights on and soon see the yellow silhouette again moving fast through the desert, away from me, then back towards me. As this yellow silhouette begins to move towards me, I immediately notice the small memorial that was placed in her honor in front of the patrol car with some yellow solar lights beginning to flicker, and I nope the duck out of there. For the rest of my time there, while working graves, I did not pass through that section of roadway between 2:30 a.m. and 5 a.m. A police officer is here. One evening about 8 years ago, it was pouring outside, and we got a call from an elderly woman. She called in and said that she was hearing footsteps in her house, and she thought there was a ghost inside because she regularly heard the sound of someone walking upstairs, but she lived alone. We went just to check it out and make sure that everything was okay. She stayed on the line with the 911 operator because she was frightened. About 3 minutes after she initially called in, she said that there was actually a man standing outside in her backyard, staring at her through her sliding glass door. Petrified, the woman froze in that spot and continued to stare directly at the man. For the next minute or two, she said that he was just standing there, still as he could be, staring at her. Eventually, the man slunk out of sight. When we arrived, about 12 minutes after the call first came in, we went to the front door. I remained in the foyer with the woman and the other officer when I went to the backyard to see if the man was still hiding out or if there were any traces of him. I spoke with her for several minutes until the other officer returned. He said there was no trace of anyone having been in the backyard. We set off to do a quick sweep before we left to make sure the house was all clear. In her living room, the room that has the sliding glass door, we discovered a trail of mud and footprints inside the house. I asked the woman if she had been outside at all that day or if anyone had been over to visit her. She said no, that she lived alone, and that no one had come by to visit. The woman was very old, probably around 85, and had very poor eyesight and was hard of hearing, as elderly people tend to be. The woman obviously had seen the man's reflection and mistakenly thought he was in front of her, on the other side of the glass, in her backyard. In reality, he had been standing only a few feet behind her in the same room while she had been talking to 911. Nothing was stolen, broken, or out of place, so we don't know what his intentions were. Who knows what would have happened had she not stayed on the line with the operator. I know it sounds like something out of a campfire story, but it was honestly one of the most unnerving and creepy experiences I have had while on duty. I am not a responder, but I lived next door to one who is very famous in our hometown for his alien abduction, but there are other stories, too. This all went down in the 80s in rural England, and my memory of the exact details is fuzzy. It has been a while since anyone has bothered discussing it. It is a small hometown, and everyone knows and is over it. The alien abduction story is that he was on the way back from a call-out when he saw some odd lights on the road ahead and had to stop on a one-track road. He went to investigate the lights as any good police officer does, and next thing he knows, it's a half hour later and he's back in his car seat, car facing the other way, some odd substance on him, no lights to be seen. The police dispatch also confirmed that his radio frequency just disappeared for that half hour. The substance was tested and didn't match any known profile. I really have no idea what that really means or what the tests were. At around the same time, this officer and some others were called out by a farmer whose cows had disappeared. Yes, there are very stereotypical cows in a tractor beam story. But the farmer reported them missing, multiple police showed up, the gate was locked, and there were no cows. They all decide to drive around looking for the cows. The paranormal magnet officer reports that thing where you keep trying to drive somewhere but always end up back where you were when it shouldn't be possible on his route, but they all convene back at the field at the end of the shift. The cows are back, though none of the officers found them, and nobody called in to find them. And remember, a paranormal officer has seemingly been driving past the field on a loop all night. The farmer was also unaware when they called to ask him. It totally sounds like the farmer pulled a prank, except it was raining that night and there was loads of wet mud building at the edge of the field where the gate is, and not footprints or hoof prints, and the cows were dry, too. The last story I have the vaguest recollection of is that it happened some years earlier, and the paranormal officer was called to the discovery site. It is mostly about a different guy, a farmhand who was an immigrant who disappeared without a trace and then appeared several days later and miles away, dead, with burns and another unidentifiable substance all over his body, dumped at the top of a pile of coal. Again, there was no sign of anyone climbing up the very precarious pile of coal. And there were no sightings of this farmhand getting from the farm to a different town, one road, and he didn't seem to be on it at any point. He was in the same clothes but appeared to have undressed, then been redressed by someone else. Autopsy couldn't find a cause of death, it wasn't the burns, and he was barely dead, no rigor mortis, when discovered. I am not saying aliens, but everyone at home is mildly convinced of the aliens. Not a cop, but a fraud investigator. I went to the site of a fire that had been torched in a small town in North Carolina. The police chalked it up to an unfortunate accident, but the insurance company still wanted me to investigate. I got there, and there was one almost perfect circular area that had not been burned at all, but the materials on it had been burned to a crisp, including the desk and computer. However, the floor was still looking as if nothing had happened besides water damage. Upon further inspection, I found out the desk belonged to a woman whose husband had died in a house fire not too long ago. I was severely weirded out, but since that wasn't what I was there for, I wasn't able to inspect it further. After I wrapped up my investigation at the site, I contacted the owners, asked them a few questions, and brought up the death of the woman's husband and if perhaps she had any motives due to his death to commit arson. They told me the story about how he died and how there was an almost perfect circle in the house that had been untouched by the fire. I wrapped up my case without any closure, but I still wonder from time to time what the duck is going on with that town. Between 2017 and 2019, I worked as a municipal park ranger in a city outside Phoenix, Arizona. One of the parks I patrolled was a 20-something acre historical farm. The park is beautiful, with buildings dating back to the late 19th century. The oldest building on the property was built, I believe, in the 1870s. Being a believer in the paranormal, I had asked a few of the other rangers if anything strange ever happened there. They all said no and would dismiss the notion of it being haunted. I had been working for about 3 months when the city started experiencing a rash of break-ins at the ranch. The ongoing vandalism prompted the park department to assign us park rangers there overnight as a deterrent and to try and catch whoever was trespassing. The first few shifts went by with nothing happening. Then one night, I got the answer to the questions I'd been asking about the ranch being haunted. I had parked my patrol truck back in a small grove of trees next to a gate. The fence along the trees was one of the areas that I felt the vandals were using to get into the park. It was about 1 o'clock, and I was filling out my shift log. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a glow on the windshield. Initially, I thought I'd gotten a text and looked at my phone, but it was still black. Thinking then that it was a police officer checking the perimeter with their flashlight, as they often did, I looked in my rearview mirror. Again, that wasn't the cause of the glow. I then looked out the windshield and got the shock of my life. Walking from my right to my left, I saw what I can only describe as the bottom half of a woman in a long dress. I could see the dress billowing out with each step. I immediately thought of the way the women in the movie Titanic looked while walking. The apparition gave off a slightly bluish hue, kind of like the projections in Star Wars. Needless to say, I got scared shitless. For whatever reason, my first instinct was to turn on every light my truck had, including my overhead light bar. My second instinct was to drive clear across to the parking lot on the other side of the park. I wound up sitting there the rest of the night, trying to debunk what I had seen. I wasn't able to come up with a valid reason for what I saw. That was one of the last nights I worked at the ranch overnight. Luckily for me, the city had installed a series of CCTV cameras all around the property that were monitored by an outside security company. I worked as a police officer in a small town in rural Nebraska. Back in the 90s, I was patrolling through town in the winter. We had several abandoned houses in town, but one seemed to have the attraction of copper thieves, so we were told to keep an eye on it. I drove by it around 7 p.m., and since it sat on a corner lot, I had a clear view of all 4 sides of the house. As I drove around the corner, nothing looked out of the ordinary. About 2 hours later, I drive by again, and the back door is wide open. I know that the back door was not open when I drove by it earlier. Looking at the snow on the ground around the house, there were no footprints. So I think, what the hell? Call dispatch, tell them I'm investigating an open door at that address, and ask for a county sheriff to start my way. I walk to the open door, pull out my flashlight, and shine it inside. The house has obviously been gutted for the most part. The plaster walls have been torn down, and debris piles everywhere. Since there were no footprints in the snow around the door other than mine, and with all the dust on the floor not showing any footprints, I chalk it up to the wind, or maybe the door just opened on its own. I was about to secure the door when I heard a loud thump come from upstairs and what sounded like kids laughing. So I enter the house and yell out, "Police department, come downstairs." More of what sounds like kids playing. I tell dispatch that it sounds like there are kids in the house and start making my way through the kitchen into the living room, where the stairs are. All the while cautiously checking the main floor. 2 more times I hear something upstairs, but since I've had no response, I start thinking maybe it's an animal. Still, I hear what I'd swear was kids laughing. I head upstairs, and it all gets quiet. The upstairs is relatively small, with a hallway at the top of the stairs that has 1 bedroom on the right, 1 straight ahead at the end of the hall, and a bedroom on the left. As I get to the top of the stairs, I hear a thump in the bedroom to the left. I carefully peek around the door, and it's an empty room with a small pile of plaster and wood debris in the middle. No kidding, sitting on top of the pile of debris was a page torn out of a child's book with a picture of a police officer on it. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I got out of that room, quickly cleared the other rooms upstairs, and got the duck out of there. I told dispatch nobody was in the house, locked the back door, and never went back in there again. Marines stationed in Japan back in 2010-12. I was with the military police. One night around 2 to 3 a.m., we hear over the radio, any units seeing the light over the water south? It was a Marine air station based on the southern tip of Japan. We had no flights coming in or going out that night. Everyone knew there shouldn't be a light flying over the waters. So about 3 patrol cars met up at the airfield, where there was a way better view. Sure as shit, there's a light sitting out over the water, blinking slowly off and on. Some guys tried to say it was a star, so we had traffic control cameras from dispatch zoom in on it. It turns out it was slowly moving out of the cameras. So while we couldn't tell it was moving, the cameras picked it up. We sat there, kind of amazed, for an hour before it went away. As we were getting back into the squad car, I took a last look at the night sky and saw a small light dart behind some clouds in a movement that didn't make sense. I didn't tell the other guys, I just thought there was no way they would believe me. Months later, I was running on the sea wall and stopped to lay down and catch my breath. I again saw a light, watched it drive into some clouds, and then it disappeared. That was around the time of the tsunami in Fukushima. Super weird. My brother was a traffic cop in a rural county for 20 years. He would always go for the night shifts, finding them generally more interesting in his jurisdiction. The short of it is that he was stopped at an unlit crossroads in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by endless farmland on all sides. It was the middle of the night, and the only light came from his headlights and the instruments on his dashboard. He knew this particular area well, as he tended to loiter in it during the quietest part of the night. Given that this was a rural area with such a low population, they would have a single officer at that time of night, and they shared a dispatcher with the local FD. He was doing paperwork while sitting there. Suddenly, the entire truck and area around it were lit up with this harsh white light. He was terrified at first and sat motionless for what he described as several minutes. The only sound he heard was his own idling engine as he sat parked there. Then he was standing outside in the middle of the street, looking up at a blinding white light that shut off with no trace. The moment it shut off, there was the clear night sky above him, and this was very early in the 80s, so he was almost staring up at the Milky Way. He says he doesn't remember getting out of his patrol car. He says that the whole thing lasted about 10 minutes, and his wristwatch and patrol car worked without issue. When this happened, he didn't say anything at first. But he stopped working nights for a while. After 5 years of nights, a handful of other cops covered him for a while. I remember him acting strange for a while, perhaps grappling with whatever happened. When he ultimately told my parents and me about it, there was a lot of concern. I was a kid when Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, and being young and dumb, I immediately started joking with him about that, but stopped when it was obvious something was wrong. He pursued the medical approach to things and went through all these tests, afraid maybe it was a brain tumor or something. They found nothing. He ultimately went back to working nights until the late 1980s, when the population grew and hard drugs started appearing in the community. He never mentioned having another experience like it again. But I know it still bothers him. Whatever happened to him? A few years ago, he was visiting. We were working on something in the garage. I have this super bright flashlight that emits this harsh white light that lights up whatever I point it at. At one point, I aimed it in his general direction, and I could see his expression change and he frozen up. His demeanor changed entirely. When I was checking on him because it was so strange that he seemed to shut off, he just mentioned he was thinking of the light at the crossroads, gave a forced smile, and seemed to return to normal. I am a police officer, and one night I was dispatched to a burglary/residential entry complaint in progress. As I pulled up, my buddy was already on scene and had walked the perimeter prior to my arrival. I spoke with the neighbor who called it in and stated that an elderly neighbor from across the street saw a light floating around on the second floor. The caller came outside and claimed she saw what appeared to be a cell phone light making its way around on the second floor. So at this point, we have two different people in different homes who have seen this light. Believing someone was inside using their phone light to look around, we believed someone was in the house. I came to find out the property was abandoned, and I figured it was a squatter. Another unit showed up, and we had a perimeter set up. While out there, a state trooper pulled up and said there was another trooper nearby with a K9. The K9 shows up, and we end up finding the front door unlocked. The porch was covered in overgrown bushes, which made it difficult to get to the door. We make our way to the front door, open it up, and the handler starts yelling into the house. He announces that he's a K9 handler and that he is going to send his dog in. He repeats it another time and releases his dog. He said if someone was in there, his dog would find him. His dog clears the main level, and we enter the home. He sends his dog upstairs, and it comes back down, wagging its tail. We make our way to the basement door, and he lets his dog loose. We figured we'd hear his dog barking or someone start screaming after seeing the dog, but the K9 returns. The trooper tells us that there is no one in the home. We buddy up and start clearing the house ourselves, checking every room and closet, and find nothing, not even trash from squatters being there. I go back and talk with the neighbor and tell her the house is empty. She could not believe it, as she said she observed the light upstairs as my buddy pulled up. There were no broken windows, and all the doors were secured besides the front door we found. I believe that she did see something up there, but it was not a criminal. I got the chills thinking about it as we stood outside. We cleared the scene and have not been back to the house since. The EMT from Arkansas is here. I work a night shift in a rural area of Arkansas, and most of our service area is mountains and forests. We received a 911 call for an older woman who had found her husband apparently dead. In our area, EMS goes to the scene first, as paramedics have protocols that allow them to confirm death in the field. The location of the call was about 55 minutes deep into the surrounding national forest, which is mostly uninhabited. We follow our GPS until we realize that the GPS no longer shows us our route. The road we are on isn't on any of the paper maps, it's not in the GPS, and we can't find it on our phones. We're in Bumfuke, Egypt, with no GPS, nor can we make contact with dispatch or the sheriff's office on the radio. We decide to go back, but the road is so narrow that the ambulance is scraping against the sides of trees as we try to back up. It's basically an ATV trail. We spend about half an hour with me backing up and my partner guiding me so I don't hit anything. We finally get to an area open enough to turn around and start heading back out the way we came. As we're driving, I notice something on the road. I point it out to my partner as I stop, and the figure moves towards us. It looks like a man dressed in all black. We sit for about half a minute, both of us staring at him, and he stares at us the whole time we're both going, "What the F, what the F?" Finally, the figure turns and points down a little side road that we hadn't noticed before because it was dark and it wasn't on the GPS. We try to radio SO or dispatch for police backup and still get no signal, so we decide this must be a neighbor trying to help us find the place and go down the road he pointed down. I'm hearing banjo music in my head. I'm thinking of how many different ways this could get why, because I have been on similar calls before where we find a crazy person that tries to stab us when we approach, or somebody who is methed out of their mind and wants to kill us and take our narcotics. We eventually roll up to a little trailer. We're now over an hour from the nearest highway, and we were later told that dispatch was flipping out trying to make contact with us because they couldn't even find our satellite tracker on the map. We slowly approach and go inside, and we find an elderly woman sitting on the floor next to a body. The body is the same size and build as the figure that pointed us to the house. We feel the body, and it's rigor mortis, meaning he's been dead for at least a few hours. We console the woman for a moment and ask if she has any neighbors. She says her nearest neighbor is a house that we passed about 7 miles back the way we came. We confirm the death and ask the woman if she has a telephone, and we use her landline to call the sheriff's office to get the county coroner and officers to investigate. Once they show up, we ask if they met the man we met. They say no, they just followed our tire tracks in the mud. My partner and I got the foo-K out of there. We never talked about it again. I still get shivers every time we have to go into the forest. I have dispatched for the police before. There was a mentally deranged person who repeatedly called our office line because there were fairies in her car messing with her engine and brake lines. I did not always dispatch an officer to her, but the first time I received a call from her, I did. The address she was at turned out to be a vacant home. When the officer arrived on scene, he did not find her. As he was calling over the radio to make negative contact, he was unable to find the caller. As he was talking, I could hear a high-pitched, keening sound behind his voice. I thought it might be something up with his microphone, so I asked him to check it. I did not hear a response for more than half a minute and did a unit check. Now this was close to 3 o'clock in the morning, and we tend to get more antsy when units don't answer radio checks. Another unit who also happened to be in the area jumps on the radio, saying he's en route. I keep trying to call him on the radio, but there is still no answer. The second unit gets on scene and doesn't say anything else for another minute. I do a unit check on him, and he says, units are 10 to 4, but Unit 1's radio is in the possession of the caller. I've only got 3 units at this point in time, no one else is coming until 5 o'clock. The lieutenant is now coming over the radio, saying he's en route. They've been out there for 40 ducking minutes, never explaining what's actually happening. Then everyone just goes back into service, saying no report is needed. I later found out that the chick who called in is a crack whore who wears children's clothing and is apparently really good at stealing shit and climbing trees. The officer got the shit scared out of him though because she looks like a skeleton, and he barely saw her as she disengaged his radio and then ran the duck away, skittering up a tree. She has family in the area, and she keeps bouncing around their houses. She did eventually get committed. Also, that bitch didn't even have a ducking car. My dad used to work at a military fortress. He wasn't serving or anything, but his company was based there, and as such, they had custodial duties at the base. One occasion I remember him going on about was around New Year one year, and he was working quite late, so it was dark when he left. TBH, I think it was only around 7 p.m. But the sun sets at like 3:30 p.m. in that part of the world in winter. On the drive home, he realized he'd forgotten his phone, so he turned around to go and get it. He parked up and walked through the glacis, over the drawbridge, and through the arch, which brought him into the main square from where his office was visible on the top floor of the block on the right. He noticed then that the light was still on in one of the end rooms of the office. I recall it was some kind of store room. It was odd, he thought, because he'd been the last one out and had locked up. So his first thought was that he'd locked someone in. When he got up there, though, the lights were all off and nobody was about. He received his phone in quick order and left in a little more than a hurry. There were other happenings too, which didn't involve my dad. On one occasion, his boss came in one morning to complaints from the night cleaner accusing him of peeking at him from behind doors and hiding, giggling, and flicking lights on and off, which was obviously a surprise because he'd been at home all night. The army occupied other floors in the block, and other blocks on the camp, and often complained about loud parties from the office, which never happened, plus soldiers regularly saw apparitions, among countless other spooky things. Myself and a buddy on my squad responded to an alarm. The incident location was an old office-type building that had been converted into doctors' offices. There was a pharmacy attached to it. Our dispatch received a motion signal from an upstairs office. The key holder arrives on scene, and we go in to secure the building. The stairs were locked behind a door that, of course, the key holder didn't have keys to, so we took the elevator up to the second floor, not the most tactically sour option, I know. The elevator opens to a pitch-black hallway, except for one overhead light at the end of the hall. We started checking doors, and so far all are secured. We get to the last office, and sure enough, the door is unlocked. We make an entry and observe it as an unused office. The door opened to a sizable waiting room and reception area. There were about 10 or 12 exam rooms, all cleared with no hiccups. We exit the office, and immediately, something seems off. That is when I realized the overhead light at our end of the hallway that had been on was now off, replaced by another light over by the elevators. I look at my squad mate, and he is completely white. I ask him what is wrong, and he says, "Weren't all those doors we just checked closed and locked?" I tell him, "Yay, so." But he says, "Well, now they're all standing open." Sure enough, all the offices down the hallway we had just checked were now standing open. The pucker factor sinks in at this point. So we start clearing offices and securing offices. We finish the last office, and on our way out, just before we turn the corner to get into the waiting area, the main door just slams shut. Then, our radios start going nuts with some kind of static feedback. Now I just want to get the hell out of there. We get back in the elevator and head down to the first floor to make contact with the key holder again. However, the key holder is nowhere to be found. I contact dispatch and request a callback number for the key holder so I can advise him of what we found. Dispatch states that the key holder was still en route to us and was advising Annetta of 5 minutes. I advised dispatch that we had already been out with the key holder. Dispatch requests, I give them a call. I call dispatch, and she tells me that there is no way we were out without a key holder. She states that the alarm company had only just made contact with one. Eventually, the real key holder arrives on scene, and I ask her about the man who let us into the building, the first key holder. She asked me to describe him, so I did. She states that sounds like one of the doctors who used to lease the office on the second floor at the end of the hall. She then states that he committed suicide at his summer home several days ago. I still won't go back there. Ranger here, I was visiting one of our maintenance shops, and they were shorthanded. I told the supervisor I would do their run down the towpath. It was drivable for most of the way down to one of our other locations. When you do, look for things like sinkholes, trees down, or anything else that is a danger to visitors. I had a girl who was a Centennial employee. We are a few miles away, and I see this little old man riding a bicycle towards us. I could just tell by his face that something was wrong. I roll down the window and ask if he is okay, and the first thing he says is, "Have you seen a boy?" My heart skipped a beat as we are pretty far out in the woods, with a river on one side and a canal on the other. I asked him how old he was, and he said 12. He was a Boy Scout, and they were riding bikes, and the boy could keep up, but the leaders and other scouts left him. The old man was at the meeting point when they came in without him. He took a bike to find the kid, as the leaders were too tired and wanted to eat lunch. The old man was close to 80. I called dispatch and told them what was going on, and they said no one had reported it. I gave the description and told them we would meet the rangers when we got to the visitor center. I told the old man we hadn't seen the boy, but there was a picnic ground a mile behind us. I told him we couldn't turn the vehicle around until we got to the VC. The old man hands me the car keys and says the leaders don't have keys. This was only Seth. I told him to wait at the picnic ground, and I would give them keys. So we go down the river, scouring the sides, looking for any signs, and praying to God. We did not find a dead kid. We got down to the VC, debriefed the ranger who was in charge, and told him the areas we searched. He said the idiot leaders had never even walked across the parking lot to report the boy missing in the VC. We go back to HQ. I go down to dispatch and ask if there is any news. They tell me the boy was found roughly 30 miles downstream, about 2.5 hours after we made the report. This 12-year-old kid covered by himself about 45 miles in 3.5 hours. Yet he couldn't keep up with the rest. He didn't see them get off at the VC, so he kept pedaling faster, trying to catch up, and had even done a detour by himself on some roads that were pretty dangerous for cyclists. Had the ranger who found him not taken a wild guess and gone way further than everyone was thinking he could have been, the kid would have made it into DC a few hours later. I learned one thing after talking to La a few days later. Never ever let your kid be in Boy Scouts unless you are with them the entire time. He said he had seen Scoutmasters do some pretty stupid stuff in his career, and this was up there. I could believe they just left this kid in the woods on his own for not keeping up. One other story, I wasn't involved, but one of our rangers told the scouts that since it had been raining, don't camp at this one spot, it would flood. He went home that night. He got a call, and at 2:30 in the morning, he and the fire department were pulling this scout troop out of trees because they didn't listen, and the water rose fast and was chest deep when they rescued them. I vowed after those two things that I would never let any kid of mine join scouts. This happened about 3 or 4 years ago. We respond to alarms at all the district, county, and city buildings. This particular building was a daycare/administration building for children and family services. To set the scene, it was late fall and we had a storm from hell going on, so we naturally had a bunch of alarms going off all over the city from the high winds, rain, etc. Normally, a call like this is a two-man affair at the very least, but we had been experiencing a multitude of alarms going off, so my sergeant went to this one alone. Once on scene and at the alarm box, he noticed that the alarms had been tripped, as if someone had entered from an outside door and walked or ran down the main hall. He called for an additional unit, and my partner and I responded. So, we enter this building, and we all have that vibe. Some shit ain't right. As we start walking down the hall, we hear footsteps that sound like a child running down a hall. At first, we thought a child had possibly crawled into a cubby, fell asleep, and was roaming around. We announced ourselves and went down this dead-end hall where we heard footsteps coming from, checking all the rooms along the way. My partner had just cleared a bathroom, and we were walking past to the next set of offices when we heard a child's laugh come from behind us. All three of us heard it. At this point, the hair on my neck stands up, and we turn around to recheck a few rooms. My sergeant contacts the CFS administration to see if there is a report of a missing child and all that jazz. Nothing. 2 more times, we heard footsteps and laughter. We stayed together and checked the entirety of that building, then separated to make sure the child wasn't slipping past us while we searched. Still nothing. At this point, I just wanted to nope the duck out, so our SG called it clear. We reset the alarm, and it didn't trip again all night. We agreed not to mention all of us hearing the same shit I hated going into the building forever after. I'm a police officer, and this one happened to my current partner shortly before I was hired. One evening, a woman went outside the house to smoke because she couldn't sleep. While in the backyard, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the basement through the window. She got closer and saw a young white male wearing a big dark jacket, blue jeans, and a winter hat with a palm on the top. She threw her cigarette and ran back in the house, locked the basement door, and then went to her children's room and called the police. The call came across as a burglary in progress, so police flood the area, a perimeter is set up, and then police make entry into the home and the basement to find nothing. No one was in the home, and the basement door was still locked. This woman was not intoxicated, was not a drug user, and was absolutely sure of what she saw. She took her kids and went to stay at her brother's house the next town over. The police were all cleared because there was no suspect and no crime. Fast forward, a few months later, one of the officers told the story to his father, who's retired from the department, and his father informed him of a suicide that took place in the basement of that house in the mid-80s. He then described the kid as having hanged himself in the basement, and then described the clothing the kid was wearing when found. It matched the woman's description from that evening perfectly, right down to a winter hat with a palm on it. I checked the records for the property, and the woman who owns the house moved in the early 2000s. It's pretty safe to say she had no idea of the history of the house, and I fully believe she saw a ghost that night. I've been a firefighter for about 9 years now in Northwest Virginia. I've often heard stories about fire stations being haunted, and I have even had some strange experiences myself at my own station and in a few incidents. My favorite example of something I can't explain is on the scene of a fatal hit and run involving a pedestrian. It happened in December of 2016. My department was responding to a chimney fire when we were toned again for a vehicle versus pedestrian. We were on scene of the fire and had to put the next engine on the vehicle versus pedestrian call. About an hour later, around 10:30 p.m., after we finished cleaning our equipment from the fire, we were dispatched to assist the Virginia State Police with their investigation by providing light to their scene. When we arrived on scene, we noticed that there was police tape everywhere. I got out of the engine and illuminated the scene to find a black sheet obviously covering a body. There were 11 police officers walking around, some behind the tape talking to potential witnesses, and others walking around inside the tape gathering items to start their investigation. Among the officers inside the tape, I noticed a Caucasian lady who was about 5 feet 4 inches and was wearing dark blue jeans, a white shirt with thick brown stripes, and a greenish coat. She looked concerned and very out of place, but she was near some of the officers, so I thought obviously she had permission to be there. I turned around to start recirculating the tank water due to the extreme cold and got back in the engine shortly after. Occasionally, I would look up from my phone to see what the officers were doing for their investigation and then swiftly look back at my phone. After about 10 minutes or so, I got out to recirculate the pump again. Just as I got out of the engine, an officer uncovered the body. The body was that of a Caucasian woman. She was wearing dark blue jeans, a white top with thick brown stripes, and a greenish coat. I instantly realized that she was wearing the same clothes as the lady I had previously seen walking around the body. I stood there frozen and tried to analyze what I was seeing for what felt like a minute. I composed myself and scanned the rest of the scene in an attempt to spot the lady wearing the same clothes and walking around. After a few frigid minutes of looking, I got back in the engine and waited until the investigation was finished. I couldn't find a way to tell the other person in the engine without sounding crazy, so I kept to myself. I really wish I could find a logical way to explain this because it still gives me chills when I think about it. The concerned look on the woman's face is something that will never leave my mind. When I was in high school, the days before cell phones were common, my friends were to come over to pick me up from my house one night. We had made plans at school for them to pick me up at 7 p.m. At 6, my parents said I had to come with them to do something, and I totally forgot to call my friends and tell them. They came to my house at 7 p.m. and called the house phone. No one answered. There were 4 of them in the car. They all told us the exact same story. They said that they were about to pull out of my driveway, but they saw someone peek through the blinds from the bedroom on the top floor. That was my room, so they assumed that I was ducking around. 5 more times, they said that someone would peek through the blinds, and a couple of them said they even saw the person's eyes. We got home at probably 7:10 to 7:15, and they were still in our driveway. One of my friends came over and said they thought I was messing with them. Then they asked me, "So, who's staying in your room?" I told them that no one. So they asked, "Whose home is at your house right now?" Again, I told them, "No one." Their stone cold faces then told me what they had seen repeatedly over the last 15 minutes. At first, we all thought there was a burglar in the house or something, so we called the cops. They came over and inspected the house. There were zero signs of break-in, nothing was touched, and nothing was stolen. Our house had an alarm on it, so there is no way someone could have come into the house without setting off the alarm. My family, my friends, and the cop all kind of stood around for a few minutes, trying to make sense of the situation. My friends swore up and down, and still do, that they couldn't have imagined what they saw. All four of them saw the same things, and it wasn't particularly a dark night, so their eyes wouldn't be playing tricks on them. To this day, none of us can make sense of the situation. Years ago, my family knew a police officer back when I was a kid. We'll call him Rob. We lived out in the country. It was mostly cattle land, pump jacks, and miles of unincorporated scrubland. Houses were sometimes miles apart, and the parched dirt and gravel roads went on forever. I think it was around Thanksgiving, and family and friends were hanging out in the backyard after dinner. Somehow the topic of weird stuff had come up, and our officer friend related the following. So one night, Officer Rob gets a call in about a trespasser or burglar from one of our neighbors, an older man who lived alone on an old farmhouse. The old man said that a big, black man was messing around in the shed behind his house, so dispatch sent Rob out to investigate. He arrived at the house, and the old man was waiting for him out front. He reiterated that a huge black guy was creeping around in the back, and he thought the guy might be naked but didn't know if he was armed or not. So Rob told the homeowner to stay out front, and he headed around the back to confront the intruder. He pulled out his flashlight and started shining it around the area. As he got closer to the backyard, he told us he started smelling something horrible, like burning aluminum, but since we were out in the oil fields, he didn't really think anything of it. When the light fell across the shed, he saw the individual in question, a huge black figure silhouetted against the old wooden shed. At first, Rob also thought the intruder was naked, as all he saw was a huge, black, human-shaped form with broad shoulders and no visible shirt or clothing. The lower half was obscured by some sawhorses and other debris, so he couldn't see if he was wearing anything below the waist. He told us he called out to the individual, and it turned around to look at him. That was when he realized he wasn't looking at a human being. He said the thing was jet black, like a shadow, and completely featureless except for the eyes. The eyes were large, round, and glowed red like bicycle or driveway reflectors. He said he moved his hand to his firearm, and the thing turned and walked through the shed like a ghost, its right shoulder passing through the side of the shed as it walked away. When it got to the cinderblock wall behind the shed at the edge of the property, it passed through that too. He said that as the thing passed through the shed and then the wall, he heard an electric sound like a bug zapper each time. Shaken, he said he just stood there for a few moments, then backed away and returned to the front of the house. The old man mentioned that he had been getting worried since Rob had been gone for so long. When he asked what the old man was talking about, the homeowner told him he'd been gone for almost 15 to 20 minutes. But to Rob, only a minute or two had passed. He told the homeowner he'd briefly seen someone, but they had run off into the woods, and it was too dark to pursue them. Together, they went back to the shed, but nothing had been stolen or disturbed. Officer Rob told us he just made up a report about seeing a shirtless man and left it at that. He'd never told anyone on the force, but some of his friends knew the story. He said he was sick for days afterwards, and his face and hands became red and peeled like he'd been sunburned. He said no one else reported anything similar ever again. I remember the story because, as I got older, I started getting interested in the paranormal. When I started reading about Mothman, I realized that Rob had seen something very similar. Everything started matching up, from the smell to the electrical sounds to even the dried skin. I don't know what to make of it all, but it's weird as hell. I called a residence out in the boonies, this was in Wyoming, so the boonies are really the boonies, at about 11 p.m. about suspicious activity. When we get there, we are told by the family living there that there are very strange screams coming from a creek area about 1,000 feet out. And sure enough, after waiting outside on the porch with them for about a minute, I heard it. It is very hard to describe what it sounded like. It was like a woman in very severe distress, but higher pitched, and each scream lasted for about 10 to 15 seconds. It never sounded like it was saying anything, it just sounded like a cry of sheer terror. And it repeated again. We tell the family we are going to investigate, so we just walk down to the creek since it was nice out. We hear about 2 more screams, getting louder as we approach the creek. By now, we're both kind of freaked out. There are 2 possibilities: someone is getting murdered or maimed in the creek bed, or it's a wild animal. As we approach the creek bed, we hear no screams for about 5 minutes. We search around and find nothing, yelling at the top of our lungs for somebody to come towards if they are there. Then, we hear the exact same scream behind us, exactly from where we came from. We get about halfway back to the house, and the scream comes so loudly that it seems to be right next to us. We frantically shine our flashlights everywhere and find nothing. No eye glints of animals, no rustling of bushes, just silence. We trace our steps back, and the scream comes from around the creek again. This time, it lasted about 30 seconds and was much louder than before. Our retreat becomes a little more hastened. By this time, we were both scared shitless and verified with the family to call us again if they heard it. They never called again, and we got the hell out of there. I still don't know what it was. As an avid outdoorsman, I know no animal makes a cry like that, especially one that can move stealthily without being spotted by flashlights. Something else that weirded me out was that it was completely silent while the screams were happening. During summer in Wyoming, there is always some type of ambient animal sound, frogs croaking, crickets chirping, owls hooting, coyotes howling, etc., but there is nothing. Until we were leaving and the screams had stopped. Then a frog started croaking. It gives me the creeps just thinking about it. Full-time firefighter/paramedic, I have been on the job for 17 plus years, and I have never experienced anything like this before or since. I want to start by saying I'm a rational adult and I believe in rational, scientific explanations for things. But, for this, I got nothing. A few years ago, we responded to a call around 3 or 4 a.m. for an elderly male with chest pain. On scene, we found a 96-year-old man complaining of crushing, substernal chest pain that started around 9 p.m. A tough old guy said, "I figured, hell, I'll sleep it off." Of course, it got progressively worse throughout the night, so his wife got sick of his complaining and made him call 911. The layout of the house was typical for a single-story ranch. The front door leads into the living room, the hallway to the right leads to the bedroom we were in with the patient, and the kitchen/dining room has a door leading to the attached garage. I was in the bedroom with another medic, and our third guy was sitting at the kitchen table, putting the patient's information into the computer for the run report. As we started treating the man, he went into cardiac arrest, and we immediately began CPR. While heading back out to the truck to get supplies, I yelled to our other medic in the kitchen to get in the bedroom and help out. We shocked the man, and to everyone's surprise, he immediately got a rhythm back. As we were loading the patient for transport, I asked the wife, who's also about a century old and in her nightgown, if she wanted to ride with us to the hospital so she could be with her husband. She was obviously in shock from everything going on and seemed hesitant to leave the house. She was not dressed, but we needed to move with purpose. We asked if their children lived close by and if she could get a ride, as we needed to transport them right now. She said, "No, our daughter lives in another state." Suddenly our third guy, the one getting the patient's information in the kitchen, says, "Well, can your son drive you?" To which she responded, "We only have a daughter." This confused my partner, but there was no time for further discussion, and we brought the man to the ER. Believe it or not, he survived after coding a total of 11 times. After the call, myself and the other medic looked at our partner and asked what that was all about back at the house regarding him referring to their son. He told me that right before I went to get him from the kitchen, a middle-aged man walked right by him. He said that he looked just like the old man but had dark brown hair and thought it must be their son, as he was wearing a white t-shirt and blue pajama pants and seemed half asleep when he walked by. I figured he came out of his bedroom and that all the commotion woke him up or something. He said the man didn't acknowledge him. He yawned and sort of bumped into the kitchen cabinet before opening the door to the garage and going out into it. He never turned the light on, he simply turned back around, closed the door, walked back past him, and turned the corner to the hallway. Apparently, that was when I came around the corner to tell him to get in there to help out. Our partner said, "You had to have practically bumped right into him in the hall?" There was nobody else in that house. I saw no one, it was just the elderly couple that lived there. Here's the part that bothers me the most: the old man, our patient, was wearing a white t-shirt and blue plaid pajama pants. So, what did our partner see? Was it our patient's ghost, spirit, or whatever? Too freaking weird to wrap my brain around. None of us could ever explain it, and our partner still doesn't like to talk about it even years later. I got sent to a haunting once. At first, we assumed drugs or MH, but the whole family was affected. Then, We thought it might be carbon monoxide, but people who didn't live in the house had experienced it too. The 8-year-old son described a black cloud with red eyes and 3 claws floating around the house, and this one night it had looked directly at him. He's not eaten since and has barely spoken. The 3-year-old daughter kept drawing black shapes with red eyes and 3 claws. The mother-in-law described being pushed by the thing and having a deep scratch on her shoulder that was caused by 3 sharp things. Dad said it was all nonsense. He went to the house and, coming through the front door, saw lights and movement in the kitchen. He walked forward to see who was in there and felt a force come down the stairs and push him backwards. He described it as like the opposite ends of a magnet pushing him. At that point, he ran. I don't know what that family saw or thought they'd seen, but they were very frightened and confused. Dad just couldn't process any of it, and it was like he was just broken. He was white as a sheet despite being a Pakistani man and just barely cognitively functioning. The police passed the call to us, and we tried to pass it back. 2 officers attended and just took the piss, but when I suggested that a family had left their home due to unwanted visitors and it was now a safeguarding issue as kids were at risk, the police refused to visit the house without a priest. We ended up conveying it to Ed and never finding out what happened. I'd like to assume it was a simple group psychosis type event, but what really frightened me was not the story but the fact that 3 generations of this family were also frightened of whatever they thought they had seen. I am a police officer. I work at a fairly large urban department in the South. Currently, I'm a corporal and normally run my shift. But back when I was a new patrol officer, working nights, I answered a call that was kind of unique, for the kinds of calls we usually get and the things we deal with. I work in a college town, so most of what I do is DUI enforcement, or responding to DUI accidents, bar fights, or any number of things involving alcohol, where usually both the victim and the suspect are drunk. There are few opportunities for the kind of fulfilling, satisfying "we got the guy who did this to you" police work. Well, late in my shift, dispatch advised that an old lady had called, saying her dog had run away, and was last heading towards a neighborhood that was in my beat. The dog's name was Rue, and it was only described as a yellow mutt. I was shoulder deep in paperwork from the night's activities. It had been a particularly stressful and just downright depressing night. This opportunity was a beacon of hope. If I could catch this old lady's dog, return it to her, and see the smile and the gratitude on her face, maybe that would be enough to block out the violence and foolishness of the night so I could get a good day's rest. It wasn't long after I'd begun circulating that I spotted the dog. It looked an awful lot like one of the coyotes I'd had to shoot in my youth that would accost our cattle. But it had a collar and a very patient and relaxed demeanor. In fact, he didn't seem disturbed by my presence at all. Only every time I approached him, he'd move a few steps further to the west. I tried to ply him with beef jerky, mingua, some really quality jerky. But he wasn't interested. It was almost as if he was trying to get me to follow him. We tried calling the owner, but she wouldn't answer. I'd hoped we could get her to come and call for him, because we're just not outfitted to catch dogs. The most we can do is just be creative and hope we can lure them into the cages in the backs of our cruisers. But Rue wasn't having any of it. I followed Rue halfway across town on foot, all the time trying to get a hold of the owner and trying to get other officers to box him in. But the owner never answered. Rue always maintained a walking pace, only moving as I moved, just a little at a time, always maintaining eye contact with me. Finally, he turned and took off, running. That upset me. I would have liked to bring that old lady her dog and see the gratitude on her face. Instead, I resigned myself to paperwork, reliving the night's violence one sentence at a time, but I saw Rue again. Weeks later, when I had a drunk driver out to perform field sobriety tests, I saw Rue walk by. He stopped briefly, we made eye contact, and he continued on. Then, a few more weeks later, I'm fighting with a violent felon who's desperate not to go back to prison. My radio mic was ripped off of my shirt, so I can't call for help unless I can grab it. We're both gassed, fighting is very, very physically demanding. As I'm desperately trying to find my mic, I look up and see Rue sitting on the sidewalk, watching the whole thing. For a couple of years after I'd tried to catch him, he would show up every now and then, always in some situation where it was impossible for me to do anything more than make eye contact with him. Every other time I was fighting with someone or dealing with some terribly dramatic incident, he would show up. One time, I rolled up on a bar fight, a drunk fighting with the bouncers. I got the drunk cuffed and proned out, and then a cab driver squealed to a stop next to me and dumped out another drunk. Just then, a fight broke out across the street. I've got one drunk cuffed, another under my knee, and this fight across the street I've got to somehow deal with, and then I see Rue, walking right down the middle of the street. He stops for a moment, looks at me, then is obscured by traffic. It's been a year or so since I've seen him. But we never heard back from the old lady. The number she called us from never answered. Was technically a safety officer but did everything a PO did. I was on campus at a university, and there was a complaint about someone slamming doors in one of the buildings. Keep in mind that the buildings are closed except for professors and faculty, etc., and it's around 10 p.m. shortly after arriving at the person who had called. Sure enough, I shit you not, it sounded like someone was pounding on a door. I called for assistance, thinking someone had snuck in and waited. While waiting, we hear the pounding again, which sounds like it's coming from the stairwell. Once my partner arrived, we walked down the very long, narrow hallway, looking in every classroom and checking the doors. Every door is locked and shut, there is nothing in the classrooms. We proceed to check the stairwells and find absolutely nobody or anything residing in them. We relock all the doors, and on our way out, we hear one creak open. Sure enough, the door on the stairwell is open after being secured shut. We noped right the duck out of there, got back to base, and watched the cameras, and it was clear as the day opened right after we turned the corner. I refused to go there at night and without a person with me. No answer at all for why it happened. Ever since we've received calls asking us to investigate some banging and whatnot at that same building, no answers. I was never a believer in the paranormal until that shit. At the time, I was a paramedic in a fairly large, fairly busy area, and one night, at about 1 a.m., we got a call to assist another unit with a 1096, mental or behavioral issue. When we get there, the two other very, very nice, but less than stellar medics, who'd been on scene for at least 20 minutes already, meet us outside of the residence. When I roll down my window to ask what they need help with, one has a look of sheer terror on her face and flat out tells me that they don't pay her enough to deal with the devil. I think okay, some people just aren't cut out for this job, and these two probably just made that list. But whatever, rule number 1 says that if you don't feel safe in a situation, leave and call for help. I figured that we'd probably be able to get whatever this was going to be over with a whole hell of a lot faster without them, so I told them to clear up with dispatch and go back in service while my partner and I headed inside. When we walked inside, we were met by the kid's mom, who was insisting that her 16-year-old son was possessed by the devil. She's crying, out of breath, and talking a mile a minute, begging us to help. From the living room, we can hear that the kid is in the back bedroom, thrashing around and writhing on the bed. He's yelling in this very deep demonic voice, practically howling words in his demon language. He must have heard us come into the house and start talking to his mom, because he started to storm toward the living room. The kid's wild eyes were fixed on me as he lumbered down the hall straight at me, yelling in his demon language. He moved awkwardly and weirdly, like he was trying on a human body for size and couldn't quite figure out how it was supposed to work, but he was clearly fixated on me as my partner tried to talk with his mother. He stopped about a foot away from me, huffing and puffing and growling. We stood face to face, and his wild eyes stared directly into mine as he called me by name. It really was quite a show. He bellowed in his guttural demon voice that he knew my sins and that he was going to take my soul. So, I squirted him right in the face with the saline flush I had in my hand. "Hey man, what the duck?" he yelled, surprised and confused. The demon's voice is gone. Wild and crazy eyes are gone. Weird walking motions are gone. Satan had apparently been banished. I said something to the effect of, "Could you maybe stop being an asshole? You're scaring your mom. Also, calling me by my name isn't scary when it's written on the front of my uniform. Knock it the duck off, it's 1 a.m. and everybody's tired." His mom saw the whole transformation, and it quickly dawned on her that he'd actually been full of 100% pure Bible-grade crap the whole time. Immediately, she started furiously swatting him with a magazine while he screamed apologies over and over again. My partner and I just stood there, turning red, because we were desperately trying not to laugh. Eventually, they hugged. We got a refusal. I am not a cop, but I am a paramedic for a 911 service. We responded to a call for an old lady in her 90s who had fallen in her bathroom. We lost connection with our navigation system and were unable to find the house number because it had faded from the house's low-income neighborhood. We found the house because the porch light began to flicker to signal us which house it was, and once we stopped in front of the house, the light stopped flickering and remained on. We grabbed our equipment, walked to the front door, knocked, and stated who we were. We heard a soft, manly "come in," and so we did notice the light switch was switched on in the on position. We walked into the house and had to walk through the kitchen, living room, and hallway to get to the bathroom where the patient was. We had to walk through 3/4 of the house to get to her. Once I started to talk to her, she said that she couldn't hear me and that her hearing was in the bathroom sink. I gave it to her, We helped her up, helped her through the hallway to get to her bedroom, and put her in bed. We were probably in that house for an hour, helping her. This lady had to have had the worst case of scoliosis I had ever seen, making her need a walker to walk. In the bedroom, we began to ask her if she lived with anyone. She told us that she had been living alone in the house for 15 years since her husband died. We had helped this lady to bed, and it was time to leave. As we walked back out the front door, we immediately noticed the front porch light was off and the switch was off. We immediately got back in our ambulance and drove off, trying to analyze what we had seen and heard while walking in. It's scary to think we were in there for an hour in a haunted house, but it's scarier to think there was another person in that house that we never noticed. Back when I was working as a cop on a military base, I loved working the night shift. We didn't deal with 99% of the bullshit that day shift dealt with, and what little stuff we did deal with was usually really interesting. Well, most every building on a base is alarmed, and the alarms are tied right into the desk, so we know the instant they go off. When we get an alarm activation, we close the base and go check the building, pull on all the doors, and see if we can get in. If we can, we go into the building and secure it. We check all the doors and corners to see if someone has set the alarm off. Well, one night I was on patrol with my alpha partner, and we got called to respond to an alarm activation at the elementary school. So we go, secure the building, and call in that the building is all secure. No problem, keep patrolling. So about 15 to 20 minutes go by, and we get another alarm activation. We get back out there and check, and now there is a maintenance door open that leads into a boiler roomish thing. Nothing is in it, we close it, lock it, and get out. Another 20 minutes. And another alarm. We respond that all the doors are still locked and we can't get in, the main door is locked. Call in the all clear. This time my buddy and I sit on opposite sides of the school and watch to see if someone is coming and yanking the doors real hard to set the alarm off. We sit there and watch, nothing happens, and right as we're about to leave, another alarm activates while we're sitting there. We inform the desk that we'd like the building manager on site to help us secure the interior and to let us in. This is like now, 3 a.m. The building custodian shows up, and we start doing a walkthrough, checking all the classrooms and checking all the maintenance rooms, and that's when we see one of the maintenance doors open with the lights on in the room. Now this room is literally the size of a closet. We walk down there and look in, there are no ones in it, and that door is locked when it closes. We look in there, and we find a single footprint of a bare foot made of water, left foot as a recall, of a small child. It freaked the living hell out of us because no one reported a missing child, and the entire building was clear and still locked up. No one left, no one entered, and we checked every inch of that damn place, literally a 3-hour deep sweep, including ceiling tiles. I freaked the ever-loving shit out of us, and to this day, my partner refuses to go to that school. Speaking of which, schools are really ducking spooky when they're empty. It's not a scary one, but I believe it's paranormal. For some background, I work for a Mayberry-esque town full of rich people, but the town itself came about in the late 1800s. Our high school has been modernized, all except for one building, which is original and from the 1920s. The HS is an outdoor school, meaning the building surrounds a central courtyard rather than being one large building. They are typical of Southern California. And full disclosure, I believe in ghosts and the paranormal, and it doesn't scare me as much as it gives me chills occasionally. Also, I'm convinced there are haunted places in the town, and a lot of the old-timers have told me their own stories, which confirm it even more in my mind. But back to the story. I'm working graveyards, and it's about 1 a.m. I drive past the front of the high school and see a subject in white walk across the quad. The person's clothing initially reminded me of what you typically see a painter wearing, a white coverall type. Not unusual for the school, but definitely unusual for the time of day. I also see that the front gates to the school are wide open, as if they had never been shut and locked after the end of the school day. The latest they are typically open is about 6 p.m., and that's when staff is still on site. I put the information out on the radio, and 2 of my partners showed up to help clear and secure the school. We walk through the gates and start checking the doors and hallways. Most stuff is locked up and secure, but we get to the library, which has an unlocked front door. We go inside and start clearing the first floor, which is uneventful. The second floor consists of a men's and women's bathroom, a few classrooms, and a staff-only walkway to the gym. As we go upstairs, one of my partners and I hear a faint drumming noise, similar to a bongo. It's coming from the staff-only walkway entrance. I think, okay, the person I saw was some kid screwing around who got into the gym. We get closer to the door of the walkway and still hear that drumming, but it's not any louder, almost as if we are a consistent distance from it despite getting closer to the walkway. As I reach for the doorknob, the drumming stops. Cliché, I know, but if I'm lying, may God strike me now. Almost immediately, our radio keys up, and we get a call for service that takes us from that school. We locked up what we could on our way out and kind of laughed about the whole experience. Cut to about 2 months later. I'm still working the graveyard shift. I have a ride-along with me, and I'm showing him around town. It's around midnight as we pass the school, and I point it out as a reference or landmark for information's sake. The ride-along says, "How late do people work on campus?" I told him it was usually 6 p.m., unless there was a game or something. He then says, "There was a guy walking across the football field." I stop and prep to turn my patrol car around to check it out, but ask him for a description that I can broadcast. He says, "It looked like a guy dressed in all white." I laughed and told him the above story. We still checked the school, but the exterior gates were all secure. It's not scary, but it's one of my favorite stories. About a year ago, I was 25 years old when this happened, working as a correctional deputy in a county jail. I had just been out of the academy for maybe 6 or 7 months. The jail I worked in was pretty small, with only a couple of housing units for the different types of inmates. We had one housing unit for the mental health inmates, for example. Parts of the jail were built in the early 1950s but were retrofitted with some modern tech, such as cameras and intercoms. The intercoms were in the jail cells so that the inmates, in an emergency, could reach the floor deputy. They were equipped with a two-way mic, so the deputy could talk to the inmate. Working here, I got to hear many stories about ghosts and unusual occurrences, both from my coworkers and even the inmates. Being the skeptical guy I am, I didn't really put much thought into the stories. On this night, I was working on the 200 housing units. It was a housing unit made up of individual cells, housing 1 or 2 inmates per cell. This unit was designated for the high-risk inmates who were more likely to assault staff. Most of them were mentally ill and/or insane. At 9:15 p.m., per our usual schedule, we turned off all the lights in the housing unit and did a final count to make sure all inmates were accounted for. It was towards the end of my shift, so I was quite tired and ready to go home. Everything was quiet, and all was well. But then I got a notification on our control computer, indicating that an intercom in one of the inmates' cells was activated. I picked up the call and asked the inmate what was wrong. All I heard was static and a weird metallic sound. I brushed it off as a glitch or error and went back to reading my favorite gun and gear magazine. A few minutes later, I got another notification from the same cell. I picked up and again asked what was wrong. And sure enough, I heard the same weird and unsettling noises. This time, they were quite loud and eerie. I hung up and decided I'd make a note of the issue for maintenance, annotating it in my shift notes. About 30 minutes before my shift was over, I got another notification from that same cell. Cell 215.
Annoyed and ready to lose my SHT, I answered the call.
This time, I could faintly hear a strange sound, much different than the other 2 calls. It almost sounded like someone was choking and struggling around the room. I jumped up and told the other housing deputy about what I was hearing. We hurried out of the control room and ran over to the cell. I shined my flashlight into the cell while the other deputy stood by me. But a shocking realization came over me. The cell was empty. The bunk beds were bare. And no one was inside. My partner suggested going back to the control room to confirm the source of the intercom call. So we did. But right as we walked in, we got another call from that exact cell. Cell 215. The cell we just got back from. The housing sheet also confirmed that the cell was empty and that no inmate was currently housed in 215. We answered the call for the 4th time now and heard what sounded like someone struggling around, knocking things over. It was quite obvious this wasn't a glitch, and I honestly thought an inmate was in need. But it was coming from an empty cell that we had just checked. We decided to walk the whole housing unit, individually verifying every cell with our flashlights. But every inmate was asleep. None of them were choking or struggling. Confused, I once again walked back to the control room and discussed it with the reliever, who was just coming in. One of the relieving deputies was a sergeant who had been working in the jail for about 20 years up until that point. He smiled and told me that he wasn't surprised. He explained that about 15 years ago, an inmate in that cell, cell 215, died from choking himself on food. He said the inmate's name was Amador, and he was allegedly arrested for killing his college roommate and storing the body in the dorm. He said that every year around the time he died, strange things happened in that cell. At the time, I didn't believe what he was telling me. But throughout the night and on my drive home, I replayed the events, and it started to convert me into believing the stories. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. I looked up information from what the sergeant told me on my shift the next day and confirmed the story. To my surprise, from what I read, a young man had died in that cell 215, by asphyxiation, choking on food. I'll never forget that shift. And whenever I'd walk by cell 215 at night, I was expecting to see Amador sitting in his room. So, my ghost encounter occurred about a year and a half ago, and it's a bit of a long story. I am a law enforcement officer, so as such, I was tasked with sitting in on an inmate for the night who was in the hospital ICU. The night started much like any other night of hospital duty, but the ICU being as it is, the quietness was quickly replaced with alarms and nurses and doctors running into an adjacent room to attend to the individual. Soon, the nurses, doctors, and ICU returned to normal operations. The alarms and commotion from the adjacent room returned to the quietness that existed prior. I gazed across the hall and noticed that the nursing staff had drawn the blinds and closed the sliding door that leads into that room. I didn't think too much of this and continued on with my duty of overseeing the inmate. The inmate was sedated, and nobody else was in the room. Shortly after the incident in the adjacent room, I observed the motion-activated sink in my room turn on out of nowhere. I found this quite odd, but chalked it up to a faulty sink. 5 minutes or so went by, and I observed the sink do it again. Then I looked across the hall and noticed hospital staff pushing a bed out of the room with an obvious body being covered by a sheet and blanket. Upon the deceased individual being removed from the ICU, I did not experience the motion-activated sink turning on. This was definitely the oddest thing I've experienced while on hospital duty. Starting out, this is when I was trying to be a fire medic but was still with the same company as in the previous stories for financial purposes, and this was when I was 22. The station really is just a bigger house that happens to fit fire trucks and an ambulance. It's also slightly in the mountains, not so far we can't get to the city, but far enough in that there's no light on the road. Now this place is old, and when I say old, I mean probably one of the first in the area, and it has seen a lot. People on the outside of the first responder world often think that nothing bad can happen in places where help comes from, but it's seen that it's fair share things. From a local farmer coming in because his son was mangled and he lost his arm trying to save him to actual babies being left to freeze to death outside the station, understandably, things have been heard, seen, smelled, and felt around the place. But this one stuck out because it happened to everyone around me, and I had a weird experience at the end. From the start of the shift, everything was going great. I had stopped buying groceries for everyone and such because we had pre-planned that we wanted to do American barbecue, but with Asian flavors. All of us are some sort of Asian. We called ourselves the Yellow Wrecking Crew, and we never got to be stationed together. But right away, one of the fire guys, we call him Win, came up to me and said to me, "I thought you were here way earlier, dude. I could have sworn I saw you out by the woods when I came in." I joked with him that I barely wanted to come in, let alone earlier and in the dark out here. So Win just brushed it off and helped start putting things up and prepping food to get ready for cooking, and that was the first time I heard about someone seeing me when I, in fact, wasn't there. Skipping forward, not much has happened. One call for a lift assist and a hiker dehydrated on a trail. I'm sitting with Win and Rio, another firefighter, in the commons room where we're hanging out, and then the two guys are newer than me. Brian and Steve walk in, and they're talking about something, but they stop dead in their tracks and immediately ask, "Kay, how did you get here before us, and why didn't you say anything to us when we said hi?" I put my book down and just made a statement about what you were talking about, and I'm not in the mood to be ducked with. So Brian exclaimed that they had just seen me in the ambulance cleaning the monitor with no expression on my face, and when they said hi and asked how the food was going, I just glanced at them, turned around, and kept cleaning the monitor. Both Rio and Win chime in and state that for the past 20 to 30 minutes or so, I have been right here with them reading and that he must have seen one of the other guys. Steve then retorts, "Just because we're all Asian doesn't mean we look alike, plus Kay is the only one of us who has tattoos below the t-shirt sleeve line, glasses, and is 6'2". Finally, Win assures them that I haven't left my seat and that he doesn't like the conversation being had. Weird instance number 2. After a couple more calls from lost hikers, a fender bender, and waiting for food, everyone's in the kitchen. We're all helping make dinner, cooking rice, making vegetables, and preparing dessert. Steve, for the conversation earlier, has been tasked with doing the dishes and isn't happy about it, but new guy problems can't do much about it. Danny, an engineer, leaves the kitchen to go upstairs and grab something. He's gone maybe all of 2 minutes, and the bedrooms are right above the kitchen. I heard him walking around, but I heard the distinct sounds of another set of feet walking behind him, and I think someone else must have gone up there too. But suddenly we all hear a thud as if he dropped something, So we stop working and are all just kind of waiting, and finally Rio yells out, "Hey, are you okay?" There was no answer initially, but then we hear him not running but very fast walking, and it leaves the bedroom area and goes down the hallway to the stairs. Down and down comes Danny, who's pale, and Win asks what happened and jokes, "Did the ghost touch you?" He played it off as he watched a link his brother sent that was one of those jump scare ones. But later, after dinner and such, he came to me when I was putting food away with Win, and he told us that he actually saw something standing among the bunk beds, and he grabbed his phone. When he turned on the flashlight function, he said he saw my face just staring at him smiling, and I wasn't moving and was just standing there staring at him smiling, but when he went to say something and throw something at me, he looked, and it was gone. So we got a call, we're headed out, and a couple of deputies from the county showed up to use our bathroom and hang out just to kind of get out of the car for a bit, and while we're gone, one of them texts me, "Hey, where'd you go, man? You're acting a little weird." So I just reply with a simple question mark and text back, "I'm headed to a call, what are you going on about?" And I never actually got a reply back or ever got to ask him about what he meant directly after. But I saw him a week later at a birthday party, and the same as Win, he said he and the deputy he was with heard the door open as if someone were going outside, and they went and looked, and standing outside in the floodlight was me with my back to the station, just facing the woods, and then he asked me why I was the only one there, and me looked over its shoulder and then just walked off into the woods. After all the weird happenings all night being full and having read my book after the call, I just opted to go to bed. I slept and had unrelated PTSD nightmares and just an overall shit night's sleep. When I woke up, it was dark, but you could tell it was close to sunrise, and my back hurt and I needed to pee, so I got out of bed and fumbled. Duck getting my house shoes on and everyone else is in their bunks asleep, so I decided against using a flashing but a pen light, the dimmest flutteriest source of light around, and lay back down honestly, considering if it's worth it to get up, but I reluctantly close my eyes for a second and get up. The second I stand up, it feels like I'm dreaming again and that none of this is real. So I question if this happened in real life or a dream, but I find my way to the hallway and to the bathroom. But in the hallway, I'm walking, looking at the ground and shining the pen light, and I notice an ankle. I stop because everyone else is in their bed, and a slight sobering fear takes over because I notice that when I stop, it stops, and on this ankle is the same tattoo of a little girl I have on mine. So I step back, and it steps back, and I move the pen light up, and I go all the way up, and it's as if I'm in some weird third person because I'm looking at the back of my own self. And in it / my hand, it's holding a pen light too, shining it down the hallway. I go to put my hand out on its shoulder, but then I jolt awake on the toilet in the bathroom in the darkness, and I'm just confused, so I turn the light on, and by this time the sun's come. I have enough light to see without needing the pen light. I'm still grasping at my hand, and I walk out of the bathroom after washing my hands and immediately step on something. I look down and realize it's one of my house shoes in place. In this, maybe a dream, I stopped walking and noticed myself standing in front of me.